Okay, second set of sections on Schopenhauer. There's quite a bit to talk about in here. I'm again happy to respond, for us to respond to anybody's question. The most obvious place to start, it seems to me, would be, but if somebody has something more pressing, we could do that, is just because it shows up at the very beginning, is his discussion of the body. I thought that was pretty fascinating. Right here at the beginning of our section, in section 6. I thought that, especially that second full paragraph, was pretty fascinating. One thing I put in Discord, and I don't know if, anyway, so people might disagree, but looking at that paragraph that starts on page 41 and goes on to page 42, and then the paragraph immediately following it, it seems like immediate object refers to the body. So I'm wondering if that is the only immediate object. That there is no other immediate object for a subject except the physical body. I don't know, does anyone think that's right or wrong? Joey!
Hello.
What's that?
I just said hello.
Oh, hello. I just asked, because it shows up at the very beginning of tonight's reading. It seems to me, if you look at the long paragraph that starts on page 41 and goes on to page 42, that immediate object refers to the body, rather than immediate object being a type of object of which there may be multiple, that there is only one immediate object, and it is the body of an animal, the animal's body.
That makes sense to me. I guess from what I've read, right, I'm not looking at those pages, but doesn't he only have one immediate object?
That's what I think.
Yeah, that I would second that. It seems like immediate object is a pretty exclusive term for the body.
And then he's, it makes sense because the body is that through which we interact causally with all other bodies, right?
I think the interesting piece about that paragraph, which he goes on to discuss in 42, in the small paragraph, doesn't this distinguish him from Kant? At least that's what I read in the introduction. They pointed out how this section is one in which he kind of takes this stance as animals do experience a world, where for Kant that's not the case. And I guess this is him, it seems to be the impression I was getting was that Kant has these multiple stages, whereas for Schopenhauer, cognition, the intellect, is kind of interwoven with intuition. And I guess this kind of ties into what he mentions, right? That causality is not something after time and space, but it's right there along with it, if not even more primary than it, right? And this kind of ties the intellect, cognition with intuition in a way that allows animals to also experience a world.
Yeah, that seems right to me. I don't know much about what Kant would say about animals, but I got the impression that for Kant, only rational beings have understanding. Does that sound right, Eric?
I don't know. I want to say he doesn't. From what I've read, he doesn't speak much about the capabilities of animals. But he, again, like many of the philosophers, it's reason and not understanding that differentiates human beings. So it seems plausible that he would extend some faculty of understanding to animal being. Although this understanding Schopenhauer definitely sets it up differently. In that the understanding is required for objects. Let me backtrack. Yeah, sorry. He does set it up differently, so it does come out with a different kind of a stronger account of animal cognition.
I'm looking for the passage, and it was only like one sentence, so maybe I shouldn't make too big a deal out of it, because I'm not convinced Schopenhauer is very careful sometimes in the way he uses his terms and language. But I get the impression that every damn time Kant says some technical term, he means exactly the same thing. No, is that not true?
With mostly, but
Mostly.
There are inconsistencies.
There are.
Yeah. So one thing to bear in mind is Kant was among the first generation of philosophers to write in the vernacular. So no longer, like generations of scholastics, had well-defined Latin terms to fall back on, but was kind of making it up a little bit as it went along, using the terms that were ready to hand. Trying to do it rigorously, but not perfect.
But I get the impression he's more careful about that than Schopenhauer is. That Schopenhauer will, like, there's one place in here where he uses the term thing in itself, and I don't think he means thing in itself, as in what's the German word, Ding an sich. And interesting that the translators actually tell you what the German was for that term, for that thing in itself. So I am guessing, so you can see it's not Ding an sich. And so anyway, what I was leading up to is there's some place in here where he talks about animals as our irrational brethren. But then he says that they do apply the understanding. And again, maybe I shouldn't take too much from that, but if you put those together, that suggests that for Schopenhauer, the understanding is not a faculty of reason, or at least not necessarily so. Whereas is not necessarily rational. Whereas I think for Kant, he would say the understanding is thoroughly rational. I mean, granted, reason extends beyond the understanding, but wouldn't he say that the understanding itself is rational? Rational concepts?
I guess the impression I got was that, and again, I don't know Kant, but I'm like taking my stab and feel free to correct. But I got the impression that understanding for Kant was still something, this is from the introduction to this book, but understanding was something that still like just belongs to humans, but that reason, rationality is still something different. Whereas Schopenhauer gives animals understanding of like kind of causality, the ability to experience a world with objects, but reason still belongs to humans. And that like, I guess rationality is kind of something that we only possess. That gives us like a different way of experiencing things, whether or not that's to our advantage or not is, I think, up for grabs.
Yeah, because I mean the categories of the understanding are concepts, right? And at least in some broad sense, and Schopenhauer insists that the understanding does not traffic in concepts. So there you go. That's a pretty big difference.
That's to me the major difference right there, right? Is for Kant, understanding operates through concepts. Reason regulates the understanding.
Okay.
The proper use of reason is to work on the understanding, to supervise the application of concepts and the interrelation between concepts, but not in its dogmatic metaphysic way to make synthetic a priori statements about concepts that have no grounding in intuition.
My impression is that we haven't really gotten Schopenhauer's take on reason fully yet, which I think he talks more about in the next section.
Right. Well, he does seem to kind of, I thought Chase would appreciate kind of the nod forward to Deleuze. He does seem to describe reason as concept formation, concept building, and application. Isn't that part of Deleuze's answer to what is philosophy?
Yeah, that's his answer to what philosophy is, but I think he actually gives intuition as the faculty of concept creation, and he specifically aligns it with Bergsonian intuition, which is quite complex. But it's sort of a mix of, it's almost kind of like the immediate cognition of that Schopenhauer was talking about. It's something kind of like that.
Hodgepodge charlatanism.
I don't know about that. Yeah. I think Bergson was right about pretty much everything. Really, that's the conclusion I've come to in the past few days, really. And I don't know, it makes reading Schopenhauer kind of hard. So I'm just like, oh, that's wrong. It's not Bergson. Yeah. No, but yeah, so concepts for Schopenhauer, those are abstract, which is, and the abstract in the kind of the negative sense, I guess. He says that, yeah, it does give us, reason is a faculty, it's a capacity, it gives us this ability that's unique to humans. You can plan for the future and whatnot. But yeah, the account of the faculties, it seems like this is one of the huge breaks that Schopenhauer has with Kant. Although to some degree, it seems like he's almost kind of like flipping the names around. But he's really kind of subsuming the understanding and reason together, which for Kant is definitely not the distinction between reason and the understanding is pretty important, especially when you consider the account of the transcendental illusions of reason and the way that you see Schopenhauer, he wants to give the allusion to the understanding. Is that right? Yeah, but the understanding for him is about kind of what's immediate cognition of, it's not immediate cognition, it's the cognition that's involved with causality that gives us an objective world. So that is quite different. I mean, the examples he gives are essentially optical illusions and things like that, which it seems like that's a pretty tame version of a transcendental illusion. It's like, oh, okay, we're back to Descartes pointing out that something in water reflects light differently. Okay, cool. Where I don't know. I think
well, I'm thinking of that section, and it reminded me of Spinoza talking about the sun, right?
Yeah, and imagination and whatnot. Yeah. So it's kind of like he's just kind of repeating things that have already been said by previous philosophers, so I think really Kant made something of an innovation by saying that, showing how reason can do this, and not just simply, there's just optical illusions of various things. But Schopenhauer seems to kind of throw all that out in the way that he subsumes understanding and reason altogether, and then I'm not sure. Where's his faculties are mainly, there's two of them mainly. Okay, so it's reason, which that's concepts, abstract concepts. Only humans have that. And then the other major one is the understanding, right? I think that, and that's more like intuition for Kant, although he also has intuition there as well, but he tends to kind of, I'm not sure totally what the distinction would be between intuition and understanding for him, because it seems like he kind of weaves those together somewhat.
Well,
yeah.
one thing Alistair said when we were talking about Kant was that, I don't remember if he said this is always the case or is mostly the case or whatever, but when Kant talks about intuition, he's talking about the experience of bare particulars. And if I've been assuming that Schopenhauer means the same thing, so that when he talks about the understanding makes intuition possible, that it's time, space, and this weaving together of things through causation that makes it possible for us to experience a world of particular things. And that intuition is my intuition is my experience of this particular thing. But then I'm assuming that then Schopenhauer would say, I can't say this is a phone until I then apply reason to, some set of intuitions. At least that's the way I've been thinking. I've been assuming he means by intuition what Alistair was saying Kant meant by intuitions.
It seems like with Schopenhauer, the intuition is always already understanding for animals and up, right? And because it always already involves cause. And so intuition already has causation built in, and for animals and up, it becomes understanding. For Kant, cause doesn't come in on the side of intuition. It's supplied conceptually by the subject.
Right.
We intuit spatial ordination, temporal ordination, but we don't intuit cause. That's for Schopenhauer, we intuit cause. For Kant, it's supplied by the subject. And so for Kant, understanding requires more than simple intuition. Like, you cannot just intuit and understand. You need the subject needs to apply concepts. Otherwise, we don't have understanding. Whereas with Schopenhauer, we already have understanding with intuition as animals or humans, because we already have cause applying in the intuition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually helpful. One thing I'm kind of, I don't know, hope this isn't too much of a slight tangent. I mean, I guess we're kind of on the topic, but I think one thing that you may say that Schopenhauer has the advantage here over Kant's, like what he does with Kant's in this distinction that he has, and especially in terms of animal cognition, is he's able to give animals cognition of, an objective world, causality and whatnot, but not abstract reasoning. That kind of just makes sense to me. Where it would seem like Kant would have a difficult time in in doing something like that, because he would have to say that. So I'm not sure this isn't a descriptive anything about exactly what Kant says about animals, which I'm not really sure. But it seems like if Kant is saying that in order to have, causality, that's an application of categories, then animals wouldn't be able to have cognition of causality without also applying all the categories, that would seem like something that Kant would probably not want to say. So it seems like he's kind of stuck there in terms of describing animal cognition, where it'd be kind of either there's nothing there, or there's just kind of like full-blown categories applied, and there's not really much in between that, unless you can have kind of just intuition of space and time, but not the categories. But I think that just does not work for Kant. So I don't know. But yeah.
I wonder if Kant might, I mean, I'm just guessing here, if Kant might say animal, I mean, because clearly animals have causal behavior. I mean, it's pretty obvious. So, maybe he would say something similar to Hume, that it's an instinct in the case of animals or something like that. But then if he said that, then he would have to, it seems like then he would have to answer the question, well, then does not instinct play any part of human awareness of causation? So I don't know. That's just something, I thought maybe he could say, but that might just cause him other problems.
Yeah. Without direct evidence, I want to, I mean, and I might be wrong, he might explicitly say this, but it seems consonant with his system that what kind of the direction that Schopenhauer is going, just not with the full-blown dress. I mean, it seems consonant with Kant's system that you could suppose animals are subjects, but not rational subjects, that animals have the categories, the same categories that humans do. So they experience objects, but they lack reason, freedom, and will, which is coterminous with freedom.
Okay, that I can see how that would work. So yeah, the categories: quantity, quality, relation, modality. I think if you go into the specifics about what he gives those as, it's kind of, if you just experience common sense objects
That's it.
and relations,
That's it. I was like, if Kant was in the room, I would put the question like this: do animals experience objects? And if he says yes, then I think we can shake out from that. Animals have categories.
Yeah.
For Kant, we must apply categories to have objects.
Based on what you were saying earlier, you said that the function of reason with regard to categories is to supervise them and to regulate judgments between categories and about categories and so on. So I guess if that's the case, he could say then that animals just lack that. Right?
You could say, yeah, and to put it in other terms, you could say they have consciousness, but they lack self-consciousness.
Yeah. So they could conceivably operate in Kant's world with the categories, but not with reason.
Right.
Huh.
Yeah. So I think especially if you look at the ideas of reason, so Kant says, mostly people will use the ideas of reason in a way that corresponds with that transcendental illusion, where they use it in a transcendent fashion of going beyond the bounds of possible experience. So they think that they can talk about God or the world or the soul, these things that can't be a possible experience, can't be an object of possible experience. But the problem is that they give that a kind of reality as, a thing in itself and whatnot. But he's saying that the ideas of reason, you're supposed to use them in a regulatory manner to orient the understanding and intuition and the whole kind of apparatus of knowledge, the theoretical interest of reason. And so it's mainly the idea of what the soul, the world, and God, but they become something that grounds, what the will, morality, and what was the other one? I guess maybe like some self-consciousness, something like that. But yeah, so that makes sense that those ideas of reason would give something like that. This idea of, okay, corresponding with that, you've got freedom, you've got a will. Not sure exactly. Those are different.
Those are coterminous. I mean, they're not identifiable, but they come. One comes with the other.
Yeah, and then the soul, and then the world, which is how we. So that one, I read a little bit about that, and it was he's saying that this helps us make sense of science, where we kind of posit the unity of nature in order to help us investigate the natural world. Although we can't say then that nature is unified in this way. That would be the transcendent way of using it.
Right.
So yeah,
The totality of phenomena becomes the world, and in order to scientifically investigate the world, you have to kind of proceed on a plank of faith. You know, that we can say things about the totality, such that the experiences are consistent in one corner of the universe to another. Yada yada. That the laws of physics have been the same laws of physics, and the gravitational constant has been the same constant throughout all time. This is not something that the understanding can confirm. This is not a possible object for experience, but nonetheless, it's part of our conceptualizing of a totality, which allows our natural science to kind of proceed.
right. And animals don't have that.
No.
Yeah.
So there is for lack of a better term, there's a hierarchy of mental processes for both Kant and Schopenhauer.
Definitely with Kant. I think what we're kind of seeing is Schopenhauer flattens a little bit a certain domain or a range, perhaps. I don't know. That's a bit harsh. He is moving cause into the side of intuition. So from my perspective, it looks like a slight flattening, but that's something that can be corrected by enriching the concept or something later down the line, if you like.
Yeah. So in Deleuze's book on Kant, he stresses that there is the book is on the doctrine of the faculties. It's really about Kant's doctrine of the faculties. And what he's mainly saying is that reason has certain interest, which would be knowledge and that's mainly, the critique of pure reason, practical interest, which is, morality, that's the critique of practical reason. And then I think feeling that corresponds with the third one, the critique of judgment. But what he shows is that there's this relation of the faculties for each of those interests, where the idea is that you have this one faculty that's kind of in charge, I guess you could say, of the other ones. So the other ones have to be subordinate to kind of the main faculty that's in charge. I can't remember the exact term he uses for that particular interest. So for knowledge, it's the understanding has to be the leading faculty. So reason is subordinate to knowledge, imagination is subordinate to it, all the rest of them. But then for practical reason, indeed it's reason that becomes the dominant faculty. And then I can't remember, what is it for feeling? I think it's desire. I can't remember, but yeah.
Aesthetic judgment is I know in the third critique, aesthetic judgment comes in as a different class of judgment, it's described as a free play between the understanding and imagination. There's a kind of suspension of it's not a subordination, it's not a relation of subordination, and that's what makes it aesthetic judgment and distinct from the theoretical and the practical, and possibly an intermediary between the two, because the other two are coordinated faculties, right? The first critique is all about understanding, subordinating reason. right? Like, don't let reason run wild beyond what the understanding can grasp, right? The second critique is a ground of morality based on reason for which the understanding may serve as a servant. Aesthetic judgment, instead of subordinating these faculties, allows a free play between them, so it becomes more of a coordination rather than subordination. Again, this shakes out for future or for later generations of aesthetic theorists who want to find a promise of freedom, emancipation in art, or the appreciation of art, or or cultural practice of making art.
So that aesthetic sensibility is connected to feeling, like understanding is connected to knowledge.
I think so. Maybe there's some kind of technical details that probably Khan would probably want to add there, but I think that is the general idea. Or at least it's, yeah, but like Eric was saying, it's that there's something a little different going on the faculties and the third critique. There's something that Deleuze also he emphasizes, which, and he likes the critique of judgment a lot because of the doctrine of the faculties, because he thought that, yeah, so the one that Eric you just described as kind of like a free play of the faculties, he thinks that was a kind of monumental development in the theory of faculties, but also he likes the for the sublime, the way that you could have a discordant harmony. That also he takes as very innovative in terms of the relation of faculties, where it's no longer just a kind of subordination of all the faculties under one ruling faculty. So yeah, interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, before we get back to Schopenhauer, I'll just mention too, in my experience, people get really deep into Kant, eventually find that the third critique of judgment seems to reposition and situate things in a much better light, which is a part of the project I'm undergoing myself, right? Rereading the judgment, but yeah, Kant scholars, and there's a reason why he wrote the third critique. It's to fill a kind of gap that the other two kind of leave open, that it was nagging in his mind for several years.
I guess while you were talking, I mean, it was kind of just making me wonder, like how, I mean, I'm thinking about section 7, where he's kind of like, taking these little jabs at mistakes that the German idealists were making and how they followed up Kant. And I'm kind of like looking at page 56, where they're kind of, now I'm wondering if this plugs into what y'all are talking about like the shift that happens in Kant when we shift from subordination to coordination. And I guess I'm wondering if that shift does give ground or validity to someone like Fichte running with what Schopenhauer's calling him, like he jumps back into eternal truths and metaphysical stuff that he shouldn't. I'm wondering like how Schopenhauer sits with that shift in Kant, and if that shift in Kant doesn't kind of like give some credit to someone like Fichte for maybe what I was understanding him to be saying about Fichte is that on page 56, he says like he misses Kant's point and he runs with the metaphysical stuff. He takes a step back. Do y'all feel like that's true? And would Kant's shift from subordination to coordination give some validity to being able to do that, what Fichte is doing? Or is he still stepping way too
So I think one way you could interpret Fichte would be, it seems like what he's doing is, so Kant in the second critique of practical reason, a lot of the things that he closes off for knowledge and theoretical interest of reason. He grants to reason for the practical interest of morality. Of course, it's in turn subordinated to the moral law and whatnot. But I think what Fichte is doing is he's kind of taking that as almost as a kind of starting place. Somewhat odd one that I don't totally get, of course, but so it'd be something like, okay, the fact of morality, what are the transcendental conditions of this? That's where Kant is saying something like, that's why we need freedom. That's why we need, that's what else is the freedom of, I don't know, what's the other ones? Yeah, the moral law. We need freedom. Also, we need some kind of idea of God, and we need some kind of idea of an immortal soul, I believe, in order to get morality to work in some way. So he kind of says, okay, yeah, this is kind of like a noumenal cognition, maybe not cognition, but there's some way that reason is kind of going in the noumenal, although it's subordinate to the practical interest. I think what Fichte is kind of doing is he's kind of starting from there and saying, yes, the ethical community, that's what is primary, because that's involved with kind of Kant's version of the transcendental unity of apperception, the transcendental ego, or that's not his term, but what unifies the categories. I think what Fichte is saying is that kind of transcendental unity of the ego of apperception, that's involved with this kind of ethical community, on the other hand, which is kind of like the fact of morality, and that these two are what generate really the self-consciousness that is the first thing that is posited. And when that's posited, it's kind of a self-authenticating thing. And that's really the starting place, is being able to say, okay, how do I get there to self-consciousness? So I think Fichte is doing something like that, although I know he appeals to intellectual intuition, so Kant says that's what, if you have some kind of a God that knows everything, he would be able to have cognition of noumenal things, and that's so the noumenal is corresponding with the intellectual intuition, and that's what Fichte appeals to, and I think at least the early Schelling as well. And I know Hegel did not like that, and I'm pretty sure Kant would not have liked that. I'm not sure exactly how to tie that with the account I gave before. Although, so one thing I think also is kind of interesting is, so with the third critique, before, around the time he was writing that, he came in contact with someone named Solomon Maimon, and he was, I think Kant said that he understood his philosophy better than anyone, but was also kind of a great critic of it at the same time. And the thing that Maimon said was Kant, the idea of conditions of possible experience, that's not good enough. You need to be able to give an account of how you got there. You're basically giving a necessary condition, but it needs a sufficient condition. You need to explain what it takes to get the genesis of all those things that you're talking about, those facts that you give. So that's called now a genetic element, genesis, genetic. So a lot of these German idealists, including Fichte, they were aware of this problem, so they all sought to go about trying to do that. But the thing is, Kant himself also seems to have responded to this and was interested in some kind of a genetic account of some type in the Critique of Judgment. So I think that is one reason I think that is relevant here, is because I think Schopenhauer is quite ignorant of this, and that he's not interested at all in any kind of a genetic account. And all of his criticisms are about exactly this, that, I mean, the subject-object thing is kind of oversimplified, but his criticism is, oh, they take the object from the subject or the subject from the object. But what is this kind of taking? What he's talking about, a generation of something. They're giving a genetic account. And Schopenhauer, he doesn't have anything like that. He doesn't move an inch from his original fact of representation. He's got representation as his factoid, and then that's basically it. There's no movement. There's nothing generated out of it. So he's almost talking about a completely different problem than the people he's criticizing. And it's, I don't know, to the point where, the way that the materialist account that he gives, where it's like, oh, you would have to believe in this idea that, plants, then you get animals and then humans. Like he basically explains evolution, but explains it as something like totally ridiculous. Like, you'd have to believe in this. It's like, yeah, that's what happened. I don't know. Genesis, something occurred. Yeah.
I didn't take him to be ridiculing that. I thought he says this is the antinomy of our cognitive faculty when he describes this sort of that sort of problem where, it almost seemed like a phenomenological account. This is on page 52 and 53, by the way, where, so for example, if you ask a phenomenologist, what is the world apart from cognition? You can't answer that question. We talked about this last time, because the world as we use the word world, or the word be as we use the word be, only has meaning for conscious beings like us. And what I took Schopenhauer to be saying is that the world as we now talk about the world only has meaning for a subject. And it seems to me he was not denying that something like that might have happened. I thought what he was saying is, somehow we had to get to this position where there had to be something that produced a being that can see, for example. He talks about sight, or a being that can have cognition. Strictly speaking, though, no world exists prior to that point. And again, I take him to be making that phenomenological. I had a student walk out of my class and drop the class when I was teaching phenomenology and existentialism once, because I kept saying there is no world for a phenomenologist. There is no world without a subject. And he was saying, well, sure there is. And I said, yes, kind of. You can say there is something, quote, exists prior to the emergence of a subject capable of recognizing something that exists. But that word exist only has meaning for subjects like us. And so when you ask the question, what existed prior to the evolution of a subjective consciousness, you can talk about that as long as you realize you're using the language improperly. You're talking about the existence of things prior to the word existence having any meaning. It's kind of like, the analogy I use, it's like if the entire universe sprang into existence at the Big Bang, And so we live in this space-time bubble. And you can ask, well, then what is outside space-time? Well, you can't really ask that question. I mean, because the word outside and inside only have meaning within space-time. So if you ask what is outside space-time, the word outside doesn't even have any meaning, except in this domain. And so I took Schopenhauer to be making that kind of a point, that yes, there was some process that produced the first subject, or the first entity capable of seeing and experiencing objects. And because what he says about time, it seems to me, supports this interpretation, because he's saying, strictly speaking, time doesn't exist until there's a subject that can experience temporal relations. But once that kind of being emerges, now you can say time has extended infinitely in the past and it has extended infinitely in the future, even though time itself only was, you could only talk about time or experience time when this kind of subject appeared. And so that's what I took him to be saying. I think he's saying that, yeah, there was some sort of process that, I think he's saying, yeah, something like evolution surely happened, but the paradox, or as he puts it, the antimony, is this problem of talking about things that only make sense for a subject prior to when there was a subject. When you use that language, you can use that language, but you're kind of using it in a sense improperly. But again, once you have a subject appearing, now that subject apprehends time, and now that subject can talk about what the world was prior to the emergence of a subject. But there was no world prior to the emergence of a subject. I don't know if any of that's making sense, but that's the way I'm reading Schopenhauer on this.
Doesn't he says that almost exactly somewhere, right? I'm not sure where, but hearing you say that, I'm just like, I recall him saying, there's that kind of like backtrack to where, we're all of a sudden like quilting point, you're retroactively just projecting worldhood into a past. I don't know. But I guess I'm leaning against what Chase was saying earlier about Schopenhauer kind of takes which in right now it kind of does seem that way. He's taking representation at face value and just kind of like, that's our starting point. But I guess I'm wondering, like, this book, what I'm expecting, I guess, this book to go on to maybe give an elucidation of like where that factoid comes from, of like how we get from will to world. Maybe he won't do that, but I'm just recalling the way you were saying it, Chase. It almost sounded like this accusation, like Schopenhauer discounts any sort of like Genesis, but it's just a kind of given, or I'm wondering if he's actually gonna.
I was going to support Chase on that. Actually, it does. I think Chase's point was that Schopenhauer is not concerned with a generative problem. But how do we get this? How do we get here to begin with? How are representations constituted to begin with? He starts with representation, and then explains from that, which is fine. But I want to say, like, I think. I think I take Nevitt's objection as well. I think Schopenhauer is kind of holding out the possibility that, inorganic matter was prior to, in some sense, logically prior to, vegetable matter, animal matter, human matter. But what he's disputing is the materialist thesis. And it seems to ring a bit like a Hegelian kind of, charge that materialism is just an abstraction, that for all of its claiming to repudiate abstraction and to really just say what's primary is this substance or this matter, which is, which doesn't realize that this is already an abstraction. And but that his railing against materialism seems to miss the mark, a bit as if that part of what, philosophers have been doing for thousands of years has been trying to address the generative problem. And he's not concerned with the generative problem, so he's misreading maybe what the point of this. And the same with Fichte, right? You kind of his criticism is kind of missing the mark of what Fichte thought he was doing.
It might depend on the interpretation of Fichte, and I'm still very uncertain of my understanding of Fichte, but this is just from this last semester in the 19th century class. It seems like, the question is, what is the not I for Fichte? And it seems, I'm not completely confident about this, but it seems like in the secondary literature, there are people who say, well, the not I is what the self-positing I discovers. So it discovers this not I that is in some sense already there, the body especially. And so, Schopenhauer's criticism of Fichte seems to be Fichte is a thoroughgoing subjective idealist. In other words, the subject produces the entire objective world. Well, one reading of the self-positing I's positing of the not I is that it discovers the not I. It discovers the object, and that would it seems to me would make Schopenhauer's criticism unfair, because it's not like the subject produces it. It discovers something. It's only possible for the self-positing I to recognize its own self in the face of this already there object. But then it seems like I thought there was some secondary literature that said some people actually do think that the self-positing I, in a sense, produces the not I as a condition of self-consciousness, and then interprets the not I as the objective world. And it seems like if that's correct, then maybe Schopenhauer's criticism has some value. But I don't know Fichte well enough to come down one way or the other on that.
Yeah.
I guess I'm still feeling like, do we know Schopenhauer's not going to go on to try and give a generative account of his starting point at this moment?
Yeah, so I think he will try to give something of an explanation for the world of representation through the world of will, but it will definitely not be at least something causal, because you can only have causal things, in the world of objects. But that's kind of one of the problems that he has, and with the whole kind of, okay, it requires some kind of a genesis, at least in the sense that, okay, sure, there's no world if you don't have an I. Okay, just accept that. But then how did the I come about? How was there at first a subject perceiving an object? Then I think you're back into the generative problematic. And I think that's what he just does not seem to want to explain.
Like, how do we get representation from will?
Yeah, that's where, because
which makes me feel like that's what the book is about. But it is interesting what you're like. What is the alternative when he steps outside causality to talk about it? I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm wondering how his like immediate object of the body, which, the impressions I've gotten has been that like this offers him some sort of weird, whether it's like valid or not, but the immediate object of the body is kind of how he gets access to the will and is going to be making claims about how we get to representation from that.
So, guys, I'm just I have some thoughts and opinions about the current discussion. I'm like 5 minutes from my place that I'm staying at. If we're still on this, I want to plug in, but I'm just letting you know, like, y'all are on some good shit, and I kind of wanted to step in the way of like bringing something about the question with Fichte. And I think Chase, you outlined this, or it was either Chase or Nevitt, you outlined 3 possible kind of responses, and I'm finding a 3.5 between like your first and your last and the one before that example. But yeah, I just want, if we're on it in 5 minutes, I want to keep talking about it.
You don't crash your car or whatever. Talk about ficta, but that'd be a good way to go out, really. But
Don't compromise your immediate object.
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
fatal confrontation with the not I.
Oh god. Oh god. Yeah. Okay, where were we? Okay, yeah, the immediate object. Okay, so yeah, the way that Schopenhauer will deduce the will, which is the thing that on Discord Hunter was kind of questioning, which I thought was kind of, I don't know, a little strange. That was the part that I thought was not that his reasoning is iron tight, but at least intuitively it made some sense to me that, okay, yeah, your body's kind of a special case. You know, usually you've got bodies, you could look around objects, you know, they've got this kind of mechanical parts outside of parts kind of thing. They're just an object among objects. But your body is unique in that you feel it, and you feel it as a kind of willing thing. And I think that's what he's going to use as the starting point, as I know that he's going to use that as the starting point of his argument for will, that it's that phenomenological access to the body that shows that there's will and representation there kind of simultaneously. And then from there, he's going to extrapolate from that and generalize. And I think that's the part that Hunter was questioning. And at least from what I remember, it's something like a kind of, he says, either it's just my body that has this special case and nothing else is like this, in which case that's kind of a real solipsism or ego idealism or whatever he calls it, solipsism. But in that case, I would be insane and just need medication, which is kind of his, I think, a kind of Schopenhauer's brand of humor somewhat, I think, is here, and saying, you know, you're crazy. But really it's kind of a reductio ad absurdum. You're saying that, okay, either I believe that solipsism is true and I'm the only person that has a body that feels will and representation simultaneously, or I can extend that to other bodies. And he goes the latter route. He extends it to other bodies. But then the problem is he kind of has to do a sort of analogical reasoning. And then it's kind of the problem of still of other minds kind of thing, where it's like, okay, this other body seems like mine. It's acting like it's got will. But how do I know? I guess you really don't from Schopenhauer's perspective. But what he really seems to do is say that, like, okay, we have this experience of willing, you know, acting on motives and things like this. And we can use that in order to say everything in nature also operates in a way that is comparative to this. I think that's going to be that's his basic argument there. But the thing is, yeah, so he's still kind of asserting this subject-object representation thing as a kind of bare fact, in the sense that we have phenomenological access to it and it's just obvious. And the way that he talks about the subject, I've been trying to pay attention to this and kind of note when he's talking about this, but he says things like it's the seat of knowledge or cognition for every object, therefore it can't be an object of cognition, therefore it's always unknown. It's kind of like, okay, well, how do you know that? But he he doesn't give an argument as to why this is the case. So what he seems to be saying is that, like, yeah, this is a phenomenological fact that there's a subject and an object, but it's kind of like, I don't know, I don't understand exactly how this division is occurring in the way that he's presenting it.
So some of that to me does seem obvious, actually. So, to me, it does seem obvious that there can be no object without a subject. That's the basic intentionality thesis for phenomenology. And that seems to be the case, that if you have an object, by definition, an object exists for a subject. As evidence of that, people who've experienced non-dual awareness, the subject and object both evaporate. There is no subject and there is no object. But I think it seems to me that that's just the case. If you can't have an object unless there is a subject to be aware of the object, and you can't, and vice versa. To me, that seems to be just the case. And as far as the role of the body, that seems to also, at least for me personally, feels kind of intuitively obvious in the sense that my body is my interface to the world. I have no encounter with a world except through a body. And one reason I put this in the chat, one reason I think that it doesn't imply solipsism is because, solipsism, like Cartesian solipsism, is an effect of abstraction. It's he start thinking about this and thinking about that and thinking away the world and thinking away this. Whereas I see, I don't remember much about Merleau-Ponty, but there's almost something like Merleau-Ponty going on here, in the sense that my body is this sensual interface to the world, to the objective world. The body is that through which literally I experience the world, and I experience cause and effect in the world through things impinging on my body, on my senses. And so insofar as the body is this interface between subject and object, it's hard for me to deny that, how I would not experience a world of objects if I didn't have a body or some kind of sensory apparatus that was interacting with those things. And again, the reason I think it doesn't entail solipsism is because the very fact of my interaction with a world, the fact that there are things that are causally interacting with my body is just sort of immediate evidence that something is impinging on my body. So my body is an object in a world of objects, but it's also this immediate sensory, it's the source of the manifold of sensation, to use Kant's notion. So I don't know, to me, that doesn't, it seems that there's a lot of, and maybe I'm just crazy, but there's sort of a lot of immediate, if I appeal to my immediate experience of how I interact with the world, that seems to be the case. It would be very hard for me to deny that. I can say otherwise. I can say, oh, my body doesn't give me immediate encounter with a sensory world, but here I am. There I am. There's the phone hitting my head. There is an object. There is something interacting causally with this interface.
So the thing, what he's saying about subject and object is that you can't really know the subject through intuition. So
and have an intuition of the subject itself. I take that to be basically the same as Kant's claim as to why you can't experience the transcendental ego, because it's transcendental. I think for the subject per se, for Schopenhauer, is transcendental.
Yeah, so you can't have a phenomenological experience of the subject, because it'd always be on the other side of it. So it's kind of the immediacy of kind of phenomenology it still requires something additional beyond that. And I think that's also why he's saying that there's no causation involved with the subject. That's entirely objects. So any kind of interaction or anything like that does not correspond with a subject. That's all object. But he's saying that just the fact that we have knowledge of it, that then as a kind of transcendental condition of it means that there has to be a subject to go along with every object. But that kind of split, that's what I just need an additional reason or specification as to why that is the case. Because it seems like, okay, yeah, subject, object kind of thing going on for normal experience, fine. But that subject seems to me to be kind of on the same ontological level as objects, and that there's not some kind of hard-cut dichotomy of subject-object every single time. And instead, there's a kind of overlap or intermeshing, as well as with, there's not kind of like some de-worlded subject that's involved with knowing things and being, the seat of cognition for these things. I think that subject has to already be embodied, indeed, and also to have something like what Schopenhauer is saying an object is. And I think that's the only way you can do that.
I mean, I think that's exactly what Schopenhauer is saying. Everything you just said, I think Schopenhauer would say, yes, exactly. So you can't have subject without object, granted. So again, to say that there is an object means there is some subject experiencing that object. But the subject as the subject of awareness, it's kind of like Wittgenstein's, I don't know if you remember that diagram. He draws this picture of an oval and an eyeball inside this oval, so the oval's like coming around behind the eyeball. And Wittgenstein says, surely vision is not like this. The visual field is not like this, because the eyeball is in the field of vision. And he's making the same point that, I think Kant and Schopenhauer are making, is that like the eye is behind the field of vision, whatever is conscious, the ground of consciousness does not appear within the field of consciousness. And so that's why the subject is transcendental. But indeed, as you say, there has to be an object. If there's a subject, there has to be an object. And so, I think Schopenhauer would agree to talk about subject or object, and this is his complaint about materialism and his interpretation of idealism, is when you talk about a subject without an object, you're abstracting, you're making an abstraction that really doesn't make any sense, and vice versa. That's what he thinks the idealists do. And when you go the other direction, you talk about an object without a subject, that also doesn't make any sense. You have to realize that the two emerge or arise together. So I think he would completely agree with that. It's just that, I have a hard time disagreeing with him, just in the sense of whatever it is in this experience right now, whatever it is that is conscious, whatever the ground of my subjectivity is, I don't experience it. But I do experience a body. And so the body is kind of the objective correlate of the transcendental subject, I think, for Schopenhauer. The body, with the way Fichte, this is making me think maybe Schopenhauer's closer to Fichte than he thinks, that for Fichte, the existence of body he thinks that it's a necessary condition for the existence of the subject, that you can't have a meaningful consciousness without a body, because there has to be, to use Schopenhauer's term, an immediate object that places the subject in the world, and that is the body. And it seems to me that Schopenhauer is saying something very, very similar to that.
I just think it may be a little early to say that Schopenhauer never addresses the genesis of subject-object because we haven't even got to the will yet. And it seems like here he's just trying to clarify his understanding of Kant and how the subject-object works. But for him, the subject-object emerges as like a representation emerges as the objectification of the will. And you could say, well, what is the genesis of this? But we haven't actually got to that point to hear him out to see if he properly, addresses the genesis. Seems like he's just trying to clarify his understanding of representation first, because that would be necessary to understand what the will is.
Joey and I are with you there. We're hoping that he's going to say something about the genesis of the subject object from the will. Because as I put in the chat, I think his problem is that materialism is it claims to generate the subject out of the object, and this problem with his interpretation of idealism is that it claims to generate the object out of the subject, and he believes. Again, it's hard for me to avoid this sort of phenomenological interpretation. He seems to be saying subject and object arise together. You can't talk about one generating the other. And so, what Joey and I are hoping is that he's going to explain how subject and object arise from, I guess from the will that, Chase has read, this is fresher in his mind than it is in my mind. So I don't really remember.
Yes, I've read some more of this and where he gives some of the deduction of the will and whatnot. So he does try to give explanations, like I said, for the world as representation as being connected with the will. But I don't think he gives an account as to why exactly representation has this subject-object dichotomy that goes along with it as a product of the will, and how the will kind of refracts into representation. But I think so. This is one of the things that bothers me, I guess, is so we're talking about all this stuff. Okay, we got all this stuff emerging. Okay, great. But what is emerging is these things that give us then causality and space and time, which means that time would have to emerge from something that is non-temporal. So all this arising and emerging and generation, how is this occurring if there's no possible space or time in which something can emerge? And that's, I think, something that is a problem for, I'd say, a lot of these German idealists, and that, they're trying to do exactly that. Okay, time is something that if we take it as just the conditions that the subject gives in order to understand these things, then we have to give an account. Okay, how did any of these things come about? They give us time when we don't have time in which things can actually happen. How do we have any kind of interaction outside of what they're saying is the only thing you can have interaction within, space and time? So that's because the thing is, so Schopenhauer will say, the will, there's no time or space in the will. That's something that only is involved with representation. So the idea of kind of like a genetic account that could arise from that it becomes difficult. Maybe not completely impossible that you can have, I don't know, some kind of non-temporal logical genesis, maybe. But I think that's an issue with Schopenhauer and possibly some of the other idealists as well.
I'll give Go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking. So I had this question about. So Schopenhauer talks about he's been there's a lot of I feel like a lot of visual in his explanations. He makes a lot of like references to vision. And he has this area about like the deaf person in the text. I forget the page, like 40 in somewhere in the 40s, where he's talked about so like I think he on 46, I just opened the book, is a reference to on vision and colors. Well anyway, so I was gonna put forward it's something that I got a feel for in the last section we read as well, but he had something about like the vision providing it in some kind of intuition of the immediate object. Like I open my eyes and I am immediately like encountering the body. I it seems as if he was trying to forward. He was forwarding very like the visual as this kind of like very as an like as a proof for what he was claiming, but it seemed to me that like a better one would have been like when I put in a proprioception, like you don't need eyesight to have proprioception, which is a sense of your body. Like blind people have a sense of their body. So that seems to be like it would be a more fundamental sensation or way of interfacing with the immediate object than one's vision would be. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
So I just was kind of wondering, is like, well, is that just like vision just an easy example? And Schopenhauer is like, well, of course you can feel your body. But what I know that with vision I would have a better understanding of my body, but I don't know if that's necessarily something about an intuition of my body. I don't know if I don't need vision to have an intuition of my body. Am I just misreading him there this morning, or?
My guess, and this is just a guess, is that he relies, well, kind of like you were saying, he relies upon vision because it's an easy example, because it is the dominant sense for seeing people, and it is a long-standing analogy to knowledge, that goes back at least to Plato, right? The analogy of the sun. The sun shines light on the forms or on the world the way the good shines light on the forms. And so, I mean, we even use that today, like when you understand something, we'll often say, oh, I see. And so my guess is he's just using that, because it is for all those reasons. But I mean, I agree with you that anyway, I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt that he's just using it because it's easy and a very common one. I also wonder if it never even, though on the other hand, is it maybe it never even occurred to him to talk about proprioception. And I don't even know if, when did people start talking about that? It may have not been an idea he had access to. I'm not sure. Although I agree with you, that seems to be a better case.
Well, I guess my response would be, if Schopenhauer is like, oh no, vision is, like, yes, my vision example is not, just surplus. It's just, you could choose one of these other senses. My kind of funny remark would be like, well, no, I think that before the, Plato's enlightened, the philosopher can have the notion to move one's neck toward the sun and thus like place their eyes in its direction. They have to like, feel themselves in a cave, enclosed in something, enveloped in some way, I guess. And that's the sense of proprioception is, I guess, the best way of describing it is like the sense of being enveloped, because you can extend. It's the idea that you can extend your thought of your sensations toward parts of your body. It can feel toward my back, and so it's like a sensation of envelopment, because you can only feel what's on the outside of the container and on the edges of the container. I don't know.
I think that's a much better way of going at it. Why he didn't do that, again, I'm just, maybe he never occurred to him.
Yeah. So I think what he was doing there was kind of overlooking proprioception, although I think that would be, you would probably have a sense of proprioception quite differently if you were in the situation he describes, the deaf person with no hands, is it? I think that's something. So proprioception, I think that was kind of a 19th century psychology kind of thing. Of course, we didn't read 500 pages or whatever of Merleau-Ponty to completely forget him, because he makes a pretty big deal out of that. And I remember him saying, especially that, so there's cases where people were they were born blind, and then they eventually, have some kind of surgery or something, and they're able to see. And he talked about kind of how their perception works and how they have to adjust to it. And I can't remember the details exactly of this argument, but I remember him talking about how blind people have a kind of innate sense of vision, although they can't really make a great deal of sense of it in the way that people with vision would say. But I remember him talking about it, at least in this way, it was meaningful, that some deaf people were describing vision as this kind of like evil occult force that could just see through them. Or, I mean, I'm using the word see there, but that, they were limited to this tactile space, and there was some kind of force that existed in the universe that could just go through them inexplicably to them, but they understood that it was indeed this kind of occult force that occurred for the majority of people, but not them. And
okay, sorry, you keep going. I had to.
Yeah. So and then he goes on to kind of give some evidence from the people that actually got their vision to show that there was a kind of sense of space connected with their body, even though they didn't have vision, but that was kind of like a preamble to vision, because Merleau-Ponty thinks that all the senses kind of, they come together, at least in this. Well, this is actually connected with the Kant and the coordination of the faculties, common sense, as in literally a sense that is common to the faculties or all the senses. And Merleau-Ponty is saying that the body provides that. The body's like the transcendental subject that coordinates all these things, but it's not the body of mechanics and whatnot. It's this living experience of the body. And that's kind of what he's saying is giving, and that's also connected with proprioception and whatnot, where which seems like that would be a really good way to support Schopenhauer's argument, which is all about this kind of immediate object of the body, is if you could do that without having vision or hands, then that seems like that would make a pretty good case for that there's indeed an immediate object of the body. But I'm not sure exactly what he was trying to prove there, as why he was saying that maybe it's the fact that he needs that to be evidence that you need some kind of like object to go with, the feeling of the object to go along with the idea of it, or something. I'm not sure.
Chase, to go back to you talking about blind people having sight, what I've read is if the person is past a certain age, like they were born blind and then there was surgery and they're in their 20s or 30s or 40s, their initial sight is very, very confusing. That for a person newly sighted, the glasses I'm wearing is part of my face. It's difficult for them to distinguish a shirt from the body, pair of pants from the body separate from the chair separate from the floor or the table that's in front of it, or especially if things are moving. There's a riot of color and movement, which is extraordinarily disconcerting and literally nonsensical. And unless, for lack of a better term, cognitively, they're able to distinguish what they're seeing, for lack of a better term, again, I guess I'm thinking of this word because of the discussion tonight. Unless I can distinguish objects from each other, some newly sighted people will literally go blind again, because their mind is getting so much. The brain is individual pieces of information that for the brain is astronomical in number, that literally they don't have the cognitive ability. And so unless they have this gestalt shift of, now I'm able to place what I'm seeing in these categories, they go blind again, even though physically there isn't anything wrong with their sight.
So I think that as a joiner to some of the conversation in the chat, plus what's going on here, and this is the thing about, I guess I want to get to Fichte again, so I'm going to do this in a weird way. But in philosophy of language, a lot of late 19th century and early 20th century have this, like, they use these like terms like picking things out in the world, that vision, that one sees something, and like the seeing this is like grabbing this, it's like grabbing the object. And then in phenomenology, I guess it would be like, that's like the sensation of, I guess, of or the phenomenon of intending upon. One places intention upon something, creates an object out of it, and it's like a process of grabbing. You pick out something in the background, that kind of language, and that gets used by a lot of like analytic philosophers. I mean, Quine is an example of that, even though he was kind of he was disrupting positivism with his statements, but it's still like I pick out with my eyes, I make words for what I pick out with my eyes. And so I guess, like, in a sense, I would like to say that instead of vision being like this passive thing wherein things are given to me, my vision is really a process of me selecting things, grabbing things with my eyes, and that's just a matter of focus, I guess, like of intention, the intentionality of eyesight, of the visual experience. So that's like a distinction between versus like objects being given versus me positing objects or apprehending them and selecting them out. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. So that's what I was thinking there, is like it and I think for Schopenhauer in particular, it would have to be that I pick things out with my eyes, because I feel my feeling of Schopenhauer is that, like, he's trying to talk about some things that are in pure activity. Matter has to be active for it to be a thing, and so for the monism, I guess, Schopenhauer's monism work, I feel as if it has to be that my idea of visual selecting and grabbing, I think has to be the case because it's an active process. It's process, so it is an action, but it's an active arrangement, whereas the other one is like this given arrangement, and I'm not sure that works out. Does that track, or am I like off the rocker?
I wouldn't say that it's the eye doing it. I mean, you seem to be focusing on the eye, the literal, organ of eyesight. But in what the studies I've read suggests that there's something cognitive, organizational, sorting, distinguishing going on with thought processes to interpret what the eye is now presenting to the person. I mean, I'm going out on a limb, but it's almost as if they're saying the newly sighted people are seeing the world like a Jackson Pollock painting, not like a Norman Rockwell. I mean, there's just all this color, all this shapes, and they really can't make head or tail out of it.
Yeah.
And then something happens where world click, and oh, okay, I can distinguish. Here's the person. Here's the chair. Here's the hat. Whatever.
Yeah. So I guess what I was saying is that they like in the way I guess they get, I don't know, like the way that so, and this is where the Fichte stuff comes in that I was thinking about, and I was wondering if this is just an aspect of Fichte's work here that like Schopenhauer is either ignoring or just doesn't give a shit about. And that is that it says that like the activity and this concept, so like this concept, there's Fichte's concept of the Anstos. Like the Anstos is like a Fichte uses a lot of words. He uses a lot of words like what's in German when you add the ung on the end of it? What does that do to the words? It makes them like verbs, right? Like you're describing activities when you do that, right? I'm not a big German head. Can someone?
What was the question?
I don't know.
When in German, when you add like ung on the tail end of a word, it makes it like acting, like it's like it's in.
Turns it into a gerund.
Yeah, kind of like yeah. That's what I was kind of thinking.
All I know is it makes an ong sound.
Yeah, the ong sound at the end of all the words. That's what I'm like. Afbong, all those kind of things. Well, anyways, there's a thing that when he's doing the onging thing on the end of all of his words as an intentional thing, he's like, he says in some of his other work that like me doing that is not just like me being quirky, like I'm doing it for like effect. Like it's a symptomatic of the system that he's building. So he's trying to build language and talk in a way which represents the system he's trying to put forward accurately. And one of those things that he does is he places double sense on a lot of words, and one of them is the Anstos. And so it's like for the eyesight example, if we're thinking about, I'm thinking about the activity of selecting with the eyes. When one suddenly is given access to use that faculty, they don't know what to do with it. It's the constitution of the thing, and one's ability to use it is fettered or limited by the thing itself. But it's also creating the conditions for the overcoming of that as well, and thus like creates the possibility for activity within that like tight. It conditions the activity that thing can do. And so with the eye, for example, the sudden like presentation of new representations, the part of my body that can receive that representation essentially, or go through all the different steps, processes that we've broken down to when we have representations. Before any of that can be made sensical to me, I have to be using the organ essentially to do that function. And then I would say that's maybe what's going on with the Jackson Pollock thing. It's like, yeah, it would look like Jackson Pollock until you're able to, until you know how to look at Jackson Pollocks, is essentially what I guess what the thing is. Like everything looks like, until the world looks like nothing when you're giving all of everything for the first go, and you don't know how to like pick things out to use your eyes, essentially, I guess is thing. It's like having drunk glasses on and learning how to walk with drunk glasses on. It's not very good, but you get better at it once with the obscurity, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense, but
well, what your comments make me think is that he, Schopenhauer again is saying that it is space, time, and the understanding that makes intuition possible. And if I can properly use Alistair's notion of intuition for Kant here, Alistair was saying intuition means the perception of bare particulars. Then sight does seem particularly important there, because like something like proprioception doesn't give you an awareness of particulars. It does give you an immediate awareness of body, but it does not give you an awareness of a perceptual world of particulars, like you said, of things that you could pick out and say this, and maybe I'm not even sure. I mean, I guess touch could give you some of that, but the other senses are just not as effective in giving, it would seem to me. Maybe a non-sighted person would disagree, but to give you an awareness of particulars, of intuitions in the sense of bare particulars.
I was also thinking when we were talking about defeat my brief plead for 5 minutes earlier. I was thinking about while I was reading the section in Victor's and of course our chat's been going on about autopoiesis, and autogenesis is another like aspect of biology that tries to explain how cells became, what was the that process like. If it's autopoiesis now, the thing is that you would extend autopoiesis to its root, and it would have to be an automatically generated process of some kind. And what is the name of that kind of process, and what could that look like? And that's like the vesicule, the model of like the vesicule engulfing another vesicule, and then that creating complexity of molecular organism, like cellular or chemical, a chemical organic kind of like there's a word for it. It's chemical biology, but it's like once you get past genetics and then you're just looking at organic structures. So it's like organic chemistry, but directly pointed at like the atomic level of DNA, and not just DNA, but of like a cell wall and shit. The hard part about medical school, essentially, for no one, that is the hard part of medical school. No one else knows that, but physical, not quite. It's like physical chemistry meets biology. It's the best way. It is physical chemistry. It matters. It's like the first section of that area of study, and then it goes into the physical chemistry of cells. And when you get into physical chemistry of cells, there is just this automatic process. There's a reason I don't want to harken your biology, your chemistry days back to you again. That may be traumatic. I don't know if it was an engineer, but it was for me. Okay.
This made no damn sense to me.
The electron may be here, but it also is never there. It's over there in that other orbital. What is an orbital? We just made it up.
There are no such things.
Yeah. But you learned in organic chemistry, basically, that you have these models, and in these models, they automatically flow. The electrons automatically will go from this area to that area when these two like ponies meet, essentially. And they say, okay, well, that's the physicalness of that thing, and so that goes on. So there's autogenesis is taking a really, really direct study of that. But the big claim that people call against it is that it's teleological, and it seemingly seems to contradict the macro evolutionary questions. The idea should be that at the micro and the macro, things should be consistent, and the non-teleological aspect of the macro biology doesn't pair up well with this very believable, reasonable micro model of biology. And I guess what I'm trying to say there is that there's this idea of autogenesis, and that may seem to be the better example of a process for us to talk about than autopoiesis, if we're going to be talking about like the original position of the subject, and when it came to select objects, or what part of the body, what aspect of the body settles the groundwork for the possibility of all these various representations and sensations we had. I'm not really sure if that like follows, but I was thinking that like maybe we could look at in our spare time the autogenesis question, and then the other one with the ficta. I seem as if like it's the activity of others, and this is the 3.5 I guess example. It's the activities of others making like your body comes to be an object for you when you encounter the other. The not, what he labels the not eyes, the activity of the other, which arises within you, the sensation of the body, and therefore that's like the first, I guess, subjects making objects. But I don't know if that like I don't know if that's actually the process, or maybe you actually described that already, but I could be wrong. Who knows? I've been out in the sun all day. It could be a heat stroke.
It's interesting. Schopenhauer mentions at least something similar, when he talks about when he's criticizing materialism, and the very contemporary problem of how do you explain the emergence of life from dead matter, and then how do you explain the development of consciousness from dead matter? And he mentions both of those and says that's one of the reasons he thinks you can't. It's a mistake to try to show how the subject emerges from material, because like Eric said, it's kind of a snarky point, but material is a concept, and so in order to say materialism, there is a subject there saying the word materialism, and so it's anyway. So maybe. I mean, I guess to phrase the question in those terms that Joey and I are curious about, it sounds like, is that can he explain the autogeneration of subject object from the will? Because it sounds like that's. I mean, am I misusing that word, autogenesis?
No, I think you have it. And so here's the funny thing. I think, and if I'm remembering our reading of Fichte from 19th century, he's in the same, I think they're in the same sequence of the dance. They're on the same step right here, I think. And it's the next step where I think they, one's doing the tango and the other one's doing some fancy salsa, potentially. And I think what Fichte puts forward is the ansatz, and that is like the that self-limiting but actualizing condition, which gives freedom the area to harmonize. What's the thing from Kant in the Critique of Judgment with the imagination? Anyways, freedom is kind of like the imagination and the that fucking other thing that I can't recall right now. But the ansatz is this like conditioning for the actualization of freedom. That's why it's self-limiting freedom. And I think that the will is just a way for Schopenhauer to not necessarily be just like Fichte, but they seem to be operating in the same sense, because the will has a negative. It's not a freely expressing and creating will. It has limitations. If it didn't have limitations, then I don't think a lot of Schopenhauer's writings on sex or on sexuality and sexual desire would make sense anymore. So I'm kind of struggling to see what exactly he's doing differently. And maybe it's like something later on in the book. Maybe somebody can say to me, Tristan, you have it all wrong. But I feel as if like Schopenhauer maybe fell asleep in class when he said that the freedom was self-limiting, and that could be it. I don't know. He may be too much time at the sanitarium, not in the lecture hall. So I don't know.
When I was yammering on about Fichte earlier, when I was yammering on about Schopenhauer and the body, that's, it started sounding to me a lot like I was talking about Fichte. And so, I'm kind of with you there. It's like, maybe he just didn't really understand Fichte, and they're not as far apart as he thought. Maybe he's sort of inadvertently kind of covering some, or kind of coming to similar conclusions. And then with your thing about the will, that's something that hadn't really occurred to me, and this is something I think Nietzsche realizes. But that does will make any sense if there isn't anything to will against? It's like, it's kind of like, you say freedom of the will, for example, but what does that mean? It's like pushing, it's like something pushing against a vacuum. I mean, there's nothing happens there. It's not until there is something that it opposes or limits it. I mean, I'm thinking the way Fichte is thinking. Freedom doesn't have any meaning until it has something to work against. And maybe Chase already knows this, but I hadn't thought about that in terms of Schopenhauer's will, is because it would seem like there's got to be something to work against. I mean, he says things. I remember him saying things like objectless striving and stuff like that. But I'm beginning to wonder, can that really have any meaning if there's not something that it's pushing against? I mean, I think Nietzsche's answer is that will pushes against will, that elements of will oppose other elements of will. But I don't know if Schopenhauer says anything like that.
Yeah.
From the secondary stuff I've just listened to or glossed, like Schopenhauer talks about boredom as like what might happen if we resist or like aren't suffering, which I kind of like see being linked to almost just that like will with nothing to resist. And he says like naturally it's kind of like in our inclination, it's just like our human tendency, or maybe like tendency is like objects or subjects in representation, like to suffer. And I guess he says like, we're we're kind of like in that process where we are, you almost, which makes me wonder how the will's like structure development into representation, like what that might look like. But I think Schopenhauer remarks like, what's worse than suffering? Like boredom's worse. And so like, you know, let's suffer. But then, I mean, you know, Schopenhauer also talks about, which from my impression, it sounds like he talks about it as something we could or should strive for, around like countering the will. And then I guess like, why? I think, yeah, why? Just the will, the no resistance, or the not willing towards anything. What's good about that?
Yeah, there's the famous line that he gives is that the will oscillates between boredom and anxiety, I believe. And it's kind of, you know, that's really what it's all about, is just you're either heading towards one end or the other. But yeah, I think so. The will, there's no numerical distinction in the will in itself. So he says something along the line, I believe it's that the will kind of devours itself because it has no external object. And that's kind of the thing. So he'll interpret that as, maybe this sounds familiar, desire is basically lack, and it needs some kind of an object. That sounds familiar too, but it doesn't have the object. So instead it devours itself. And that's basically going to be the basis of his pessimism, is that desires lack. And so Alistair thinks that this is a mistake of Schopenhauer's, and that it's really he's giving a transitive kind of notion of the will as if it needs an object, where he's saying that that's actually not what he can deduce. It is only an intransitive thing. So it's only the will willing. Indeed, it's devouring itself. Why does it? The idea of that there being some kind of an external object that it needs to will, I think that ceases to make much sense. It's because indeed I think you can only have just the will, but willing itself in this kind of plenitude, really productive plenitude of the willing, which indeed can be a kind of resistance. But yeah, he's going to take the our kind of conscious experience of willing, where we have an object. This is more wishing, like I want something, and he's going to take that and kind of like throw it into the transcendental and say that it's lack, and therefore we should negate life. The end.
So I have this idea that Schopenhauer may be a very sophisticated solipsist. I mean, he says world as, I mean, before I look at, look at the title up again, the world is will and representation, the world as will. And so like, I have this feelings that the sensation of a will that he, or the intuition of a will that he has is not his will. It's just the will out there. And that what I feel as if maybe, I don't know, maybe this is just a problem with I read a very short introduction to Schopenhauer to like refresh my like general like Schopenhauer stuff. And for some reason I had this like memory, this belief of a memory that Schopenhauer is basically saying like, oh, I only sense the world's will, and I can only like actualize it. Well, I guess it only shows me like the things for which it can actually do. So it's almost like all of what we would call wills, our individual wills, are really just like chimeras. They're phantoms, and there's just one will that we're all like interfacing with. So that just seems like sophisticated solicism in some way. Like it's all one mind, man. And we're all just part of it. Kind of stuff. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so what he talks about this with the principle of individuation is this thing, the will doesn't have any kind of individual distinction within it. That's something that occurs with representation. And again, if he has a reason for how he gets from unindividuated to individuated exactly, I'm not sure of what it is, but this is kind of saying the will is unindividuated. Individuation involves representation, and somehow there's this kind of like emanation from the unindividuated into the individuated, and that's indeed what we experience is the will as, for some reason I want to say refracted, maybe because I was reading Bergson earlier and he talks about that, but the will is kind of refracted into individuals. And indeed, this is really a part of the problem of our situation and why we need a kind of pessimistic redemption from our individualities, because it's a kind of falsity. Because the will is really in itself unindividuated, yet we are individuated. And I think this is going to be one of the issues that is going to lead to him saying that, yeah, we need to renounce these things. And a lot of his ethics is centered on that idea too of you have a kind of metaphysical realization of that individuation is an illusion, and you get a sense of, the unity of the metaphysical principle of the will or whatnot. And from that, you can have an experience of empathy with other individuals, knowing that metaphysically you're the same thing. So that's kind of his ethics too. So he'll do a lot with this. But yeah, as far as whether that's solipsism, I think that would be. I'm definitely open to the idea that Schopenhauer's some kind of a solipsist, but I think he's probably a solipsist without necessarily knowing it. Although I think most idealists are probably solipsist without knowing it. That would be my conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll have to withhold some kind of judgment until I get to that part of the reading. But I wonder if individuation and what Fichte calls Anstos, on one part of his talking about the summons, is like the same kind of process going on. I have a feeling that it's not, because of the directions that they go, and I think that might be the significant crux where the two depart. Because part of me thinks that, like, in Schopenhauer's system, just from what you said just now, that alterity is like a phantom, that there's no such thing as alterity underneath his thing. There can be no like alterity with another will, another freedom. And I think that for Fichte, you need some kind of alterity with another. For his whole system, you need alterity with another free thing, and you can only have you come to know that it's a free thing because it limits your freedom, because to engage with it you have to limit your freedom. So it's self-limiting, for the possibility of the inner subjective relation. That's really complicated. It's like 3 pages in his book on language, but yeah, I think that's where they're going to break apart, is on the anstos. I don't know if that
was, I mean, that's kind of in line with my sympathies. I don't know if you saw, I scrunched my nose when Chase was talking about how we discover empathy when we can decide that we're all the same will. That to me is very dangerous territory. It makes love conditional on identity, things being the same. Kind of flies in the face of some other theories where love is predicated precisely on difference as such. And anyway, I know which notion holds up better prospect for peace.
It's sort of a sophisticated egoism. I love the world because I realize everyone is me.
Yeah, that's right. That sounds kind of like where the direction Chase was taking Schopenhauer's line of thought, and Tristan contrasting Fichte, and we can also talk about Hegel specifically, defines love in terms of recognizing and accepting the other in their otherness, radical otherness, right? Yeah.
So I will say though that I guess as I've been a little harsh on old man Schopenhauer, I'll say that the self, the identity that he is indicating is of course not the individuated ego self, which he's pretty. So I think there's another thing about Schopenhauer is to be consistent, he definitely needs to advocate suicide, like immediately. Like, I don't, this is one thing about, pessimist antinatalists that kind of pisses me off, is that usually they will not really follow through to the logical conclusions of their ideas. And they usually have some kind of very tortured logic as to why suicide is a bad idea. And I think because this is my take, why not, already going into it. So I think the value that a lot of people talk about when they're trying to determine something like this, it already uses life as that's the criterion of value. And it doesn't make any sense to kind of try and negate that and have an argument about the value of negating life, because life is itself the criterion of value. And that's why I think, it makes sense on one level, of consistency with what Schopenhauer is saying, but on another level, I think there's some issues there. But I'll say, so it's really this first book that I don't like this book. The World as Representation, First Consideration. I seriously have not enjoyed reading this. I'm just like, parts of it I totally agree with, and then other parts I'm just like, oh no. The other 3 parts I think are better, it's not like I completely agree with those, but seriously, at least I like reading his pessimism. I don't know, it's something like enjoyable about it. I disagree with it, but it's at least enjoyable, where I think representation, I hate the word representation. I hate I don't care about representation. Just give me the will already. I just want the wills. That's interesting. Representation, don't care. Let's move on quickly. I was seriously looking at the schedule and thinking like, oh no, 3 more weeks on this book, and he's going to be talking about reason and Stoic ethics and all this crap. that. So when I read excerpts of this for my class, we obviously skipped those parts, and I think you'll find why because I just looking through it. Yeah, it looks a little tortured. So yeah, maybe I'll just disappear for 3 weeks and then come back and do book 2.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel it. Hey, I'm gonna get off and run, guys. I'm super happy I got to get in. I didn't think I was gonna be able to make it tonight, so I told my wife this is like my version of AA.
Yeah.
Where we talk about suicide.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, now to get off this. I'm at the press.
Okay.
So, all right, see ya.
Night night. Well, thank you guys.
Yep.
It was interesting and enlightening and only mildly depressing.
That's good. Yeah.
So shall we adjourn?
I believe so. Yeah.
Take care. Thanks.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Okay. Bye-bye.